We will be starting chapter 25, Genesis chapter 25, in just a moment or two. Need to keep in mind all of those that are on our sick list. Brother Jackie Bozeman, Brother Terry, Janice, as they'll be going to the doctor on the 29th. Tina, Holly's still with her back. The Fullers, the Stablers. We just got a whole group of people that are on the sick and injured list. Lisa is back from Utah. Hadn't seen her this morning, but Luke said she was here. And also, Brother Cox told me this morning, if you talk to him and he doesn't talk back, don't get mad at him. He's not ignoring you. He had a reaction to something, some chemical, and he's all choked up and can't talk good this morning. So, but is there anyone else that we need to keep in thoughts and prayers for the sick and injured? Okay. Brother Cox, how about you leading us in a prayer? Well, no, you can't do that. Brother Henderson, Brother Henderson, would you lead us in a prayer then, please?
Father, we pray for those who are sick and are injured, that it is your will to restore them to their health. Father, may during this course of an hour, we learn a greater lesson of your love and the things that you have done to make our lives what it is today. And may we always be grateful to you for the good things that we have in our lives. Father, we love you and thank you.
Some of you might think that was mighty mean of me doing that to Jim, but actually that's just how short my memory is anymore. I just hadn't even thought about it. So, chapter 25. If you have a worksheet and are trying to follow it, some things got jumbled up, and today we were supposed to jump over, according to the list, we were to jump over to chapter 37, and then in September we go back to 25. Well, I talked to Brother Terry, and we're not going to be jumping around that way. We're just going to continue through, and so today we'll be on 25. Then again, Abraham took a wife, and her name was Keturah. If you look at 1 Chronicles chapter 1 and verse 32 and 33, it says that Abraham had a concubine. And if you go on down in this chapter that we're looking at, chapter 25, if you go all the way down to verse 6, it says, "But unto the sons of the concubines." So, was Keturah Abraham's wife, or was she his concubine? And what is the difference between the two? I want to take just a minute here to try to help us understand the Bible as a whole as we go through things, the way things are worded sometimes. There are some that go over to David, Saul, Solomon. If you go into 1 Kings, when it's talking about Solomon, Solomon had wives and concubines. David had wives and concubines, multiples. So what is the difference then between a wife and a concubine? Well, y'all have heard me say in here repeatedly that one thing that helps me personally understand the Bible more is to put things in a timeline. When we're looking at David and Solomon, That period of time is referred to as the monarchy because each one was a monarch, if you look at your political histories. And we're looking at about 1,000 years BC. When we go back to Abraham, we're looking at probably around 2000 BC, so we're 1,000 years apart. Words change in meaning. There's a word called an anachronism where sometimes people take events, places, not places, but events, objects, people, and even verbal phrases or expressions out of place. And I think for those that have a problem understanding the difference here is they're doing that. They look over at 1,000 years BC at Solomon and said, wives and concubines, two distinct different things. But when we go back to the patriarchal age, if you go back to a closer representation, if you just move forward in the book of Genesis just a little bit, who was Bilhah? That was Rachel's handmaid, or her maid, her servant that her father had given her when she married Jacob. All right? It says that she gave her to Jacob a wife, basically a surrogate mother, so she could have children because she was barren. A few chapters later, when Reuben goes into her, he calls her his father's concubine. So if we look at the patriarchal age, concubine and wife would be synonymous, could be used either or, whereas in the monarchy period, they're two distinct different things. Now, there is one thing that separates them and would make them easily identifiable as what would be referred to as concubine. Remember, we went over to Hebrews and we talked about just the difference between Sarah and Hagar. And what did it say about Sarah in Hebrews? She was a free woman, and Hagar was a bond woman. So the difference then would be, just like if we go forward in Genesis, Bilhah is Rachel's maid or servant. So that would be the distinction, that they're wives, but if you call them, they would call the concubine part would be that they were not on the same level as the wife. Does that make sense? If you look at it this way, in our lifetime, everyone in here, in our lifetime, words have changed meaning. Words have changed meaning. My first name is Johnny. I go by my middle name, Larry, because I'm a good old Southern boy. But my first name is Johnny. 40 years ago, if you had met my wife for the first time and I was not around and y'all started talking about who you are and what you're doing, are you married? Yeah. My husband's name is Johnny. Today, well, back then, 40 years ago, you would automatically know that she had a husband, a man by the name of Johnny. Today, if that same situation were to occur, what could you absolutely know? If she said, I'm married, Johnny, my husband's name is Johnny. Well, because of the court systems and the way things go today, Johnny could be male or female. Andrea, in her workplace, has had women come in and introduce their husband, which was very evidently a woman. So just the word marriage today within our life, within the past few years, not even our whole life, it's been transitioning for a long time, but just within the past 5 years, the word marriage has a whole new meaning. The same way that we can look at this, instead of 1,000 years apart, we're only looking at 5 years apart. So if you put things in a timeline and you the Bible is the best dictionary for itself, but you have to look at things in context. You have to look at things in their own time period for it to explain itself. So Abraham took a wife. Her name was Keturah. Apparently she was a handmaid or somebody else, because later it calls her a concubine, but he took her as a wife, and she bore him a lot of children. Questions or comments, or if I confused you or helped, or must have you so confused you don't even know what questions to ask. Huh? Okay. We're not going to read all the names of the kids. We're going to just skip down to verse 5 because she bare him a bunch of kids. And then those kids had kids. And then it said, well, at the end of verse 4, it says, all these were the children of Keturah. Now, she didn't have all those, but they were in her lineage, kids, grandkids. Verse 5 says, and Abraham gave all that he had unto Isaac. Now, this was also stated back in Genesis 24 and 36 when Abraham had sent for a wife, and they had talked about what Abraham had and what he had given Isaac, or so he had already transferred everything over to Isaac. Then verse 6 says, but unto the sons of the concubines which Abraham had, Abraham gave gifts and sent them away from Isaac his son, while he yet lived, eastward unto the east country. What would be the east country if we were to call it by a specific name? Basically the area of Arabia. Okay. Who else went over in that direction? Ishmael, earlier, okay? Verse 7, and these are the days of the years of Abraham's life, which he lived, 180 years. So he lived 175 years. Then Abraham gave up the ghost and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. Do you find it interesting that they used the phrase that he died in a good old age? If you go back to chapter 15 and verse 15, when he was a lot younger, 75, 85 years younger or so, what had that angel told him when he and Sarah was going to have children? That he would die in a good old age. And now he died in a good old age. I also find this next verse kind of interesting. His sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar, the Hittite, which is before Mamre. Well, we know that Abraham had bought the field with the caves to bury his wife, Sarah. Now, he's 175 years of age when he dies. How old was he when Ishmael was born? 86. So about 86 or so. We haven't heard of Ishmael for about 13 years or so since he was left the camp, right? When they sent him away. So for probably 75 years, Ishmael has not been in the picture. But now Ishmael and Isaac get together to bury the father. Do you find that kind of interesting? See, I used to work at a funeral home, and some of the worst fights that I have ever seen was estranged family members coming to funerals. people that had had no contact with somebody for years wanted to take over and run the show when a person died, or they wanted to get their share or whatever. But I have seen some horrendous fights. But here it looks like these two came together peaceably to bury their father with the honor that was due him. Now, as we go along, I'm not going to pick up book, chapter, and verse right now, but as we go along in this, we are going to find out that Ishmael later has something to do with Joseph. When Joseph is sold into slavery in Egypt, who bought and sold him? Ishmaelites. Where did the Ishmaelites come from? Ishmael. And the Midianites. And those two words are used interchangeably. And basically, if you look at your geography, try to picture it mentally, you've got Egypt. Well, I can't point it out. You've got Egypt here, and then right up here is what is now called Saudi Arabia. And in this area is Arabia. And right along the border there, we'll find out that that's about shore is where the Ishmaelites lived. So, and then Ishmael has 12 princes, which became basically the Arabian nations, the 12 tribes over there. And if we go all the way into the book of Psalms, we will find out that the Ishmaelites even made a pact or a compact or a covenant wanting to destroy Israel. So there has been no love between Israel, Isaac at this point, and Ishmael for many years, but yet they come together peaceably to bury the father. And then later, we're going to see that controversy arise again. Questions, comments? Brother Golden, you're very up. Right. He had sent them eastward, and it looks like it was just the first son and then Isaac, the son of promise. It looks like that's, And back in those days, and in a lot of cultures, the firstborn has all the responsibility is heaped on them. And when Andrea's father died, and then her mother got put in a nursing home, the oldest brother, who lives right there and is taking care of just about everything, handed over to Andrea some stuff and said, "You're the oldest, you make decisions on these." So culturally speaking, generally the oldest has at least some implied authority or responsibility. And here the oldest son was the one that had been run off, but then the son of promise had to be there too. So like I say, it appears as though none of Keturah's or none of the others were there. It was just those two. So anything else on that? Yes, ma'am. Right. Yeah. Esau, as we get farther on down into the book, he took wives that wasn't approved of, that came from that side of the family. Verse 10 then says, "The field which Abraham purchased and from the sons of Heth, and there Abraham was buried, and Sarah his wife." So anything through verse 10 then?
All of these nations and so forth came from Abraham, and then there were other people. All these nations came from Noah.
Right.
And Christ came, and he was the seed that promised Abraham. And then all the nations of the earth are blessed. So even all of these nations all over the world, no matter where they are, as long as they become Christians, then they are part of the citizenship. the citizens didn't have it.
Right. And like you say, everything came from Noah's clan, but the big dividing mark is right there at Abraham, Ishmael and Isaac, the two religious paths, so to speak. Okay. Anything else? Verse 11, it came to pass after the death of Abraham. Well, let me back up just a minute. I want to go all the way back to verse 8 because I wanted to point something out. He died in an old age, full of years, was gathered to his people. Have you ever thought about that phrase in there? He was gathered to his people. He's dead. What does that phrase mean? Pardon? A little more than that. I take it to be how often when we know somebody that has lived a very righteous life dies, they're going home to be with their family, going to heaven. So when they're gathered to his people, they're referring to him being the religious person that going home. Same way I hope to go home one day. Now back to verse 11. It came to pass after the death of Abraham that God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac dwelt by the well. And I'm not going to try to pronounce that name. I've tried several different times and ways, and I always get it mixed up. So I do know that it's got a longer name. If you go back to chapter 16, there's a beer in front of it. So we're just going to leave it at that. But God blessed his son Isaac. That means that now Isaac, where Abraham was the patriarch in charge of everything, now Isaac is in charge of everything. Starting with verse 12 then through about verse 18, it gives a genealogy. These are the genealogy or generations of Ishmael, who was Abraham's son by Hagar, the Egyptian. Also spells out it was Sarah's handmaid. Again, I think trying to draw a division about who's who. Putting Hagar on a little less line there. And then it listed the names, the generations all the way down through there. And then in verse 18 it picks up. Verse 17 says, and these are the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years he gave up the ghost and died and was gathered unto his people. And he went wherever they went. Now, verse 18 says, they dwelt from Havilah and unto Sur, and that is before Egypt. And like I said, that is sort of the border, right on the border there of Egypt and Arabia, or Saudi Arabia, which later becomes, basically all Arab. These are the generations, and then verse 19 starts with the generations of Isaac. That goes down for quite a ways, but we're going to look at verse 20. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to wife, the daughter of Bethuel, the Syrian, of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban, the Syrian. Now, how old was Abraham when Isaac was born? 100. He's 40 years old when he marries Rebekah. So how old is Abraham? And he dies at 175. So that meant that he lived for 35 years after. So he got to see some of his grandkids. And how old was Sarah when she died? Okay. So that would have put Isaac at 37 when Sarah died. So she was dead about 3 years at this point. Okay. Isaac entreated the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord was entreated of him, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. I want to skip all the way down to verse 26 for a minute. After that came out, we'll go back and fill all this in, but I want to skip down to this verse for just a second. And after that came out his brother, and his hand took hold on Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 80 years old when she bare them. So if he was 40 when he got married, he's 60 now. That means that she had been barren for 19 years, because you got to give 9 months or so. We're rounding years off here, but she had been barren for about 19 years before Isaac had made that prayer or that entreaty to the Lord. And then she bare when he was 60 years of age. You got your hand going up, Brother Go? About 15 when they died, correct. Thank you. That puts everything right in a timeline for us. Yes, sir. So now back up to 21. And Isaac entreated the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord was entreated of him, and Rebekah his wife conceived. And the children struggled together within her, and she said, If it be so, why am I thus? And she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels, and the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. And when her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb, and the first came out red all over like an hairy garment. They called his name Esau, and after that came his brother, and his hand took hold on Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 80 years old when she bare them. I'm going to ask you just to think about something for a minute. If you lived in a culture where there was a pecking order, a hierarchy, and it was the oldest that got the best, and all like this, the real place of honor. I mean, you can go to England today, and who's next in line to be king or queen? And the only way they're going to skip it is if one abdicates or dies, and to go to the next. So what would you think that Rebekah was thinking at this point when she is told that the older is going to serve the younger? That is just totally out of not proper. Nobody got any thoughts? There you go. She has to take into account who's talking to her and who told it to her. And I don't know if this has anything to do with it or not, but who was her favorite? And who was Isaac's favorite? Okay. I really don't think it had that much. I don't think that statement had anything to do with it. I think it was just that today we would call it that Jacob was more of a mama's boy. He liked to do things around the house, and Esau liked to do things out in the woods. So I think that would be the distinction there. But verse 27, the boys grew old, the boys grew, and Esau was a cunning hunter, man of the field, and Jacob was a plain man dwelling in tents. He was a city dweller, so to speak, and Esau was the outdoorsman. Isaac loved Esau because he did eat of his venison, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And Jacob sawed pottage, and Esau came from the field, and he was faint. And Esau said to Jacob, feed me, I pray thee, with that same red pottage, for I am faint. Therefore was his name called Edom. And Jacob said, sell me this day thy birthright. And Esau said, behold, I am at the point to die, and what profit shall this birthright do to me? And Jacob said, swear to me this day. And he sware unto him, and he sold his birthright unto Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and pottage of lentils, and he did eat and drink, and rose up and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. How many of you in here have camped out or hunted or been away from food for a day? Brother Grant, at the end of that day, was you at the point where you would have given away your birthright for a bowl of soup?
I would find something to eat, but, myself, that's just being me. I'm pretty desperate for, get something, but, birthright, I don't know, that's a little too bad.
You definitely wouldn't give up your favorite thing, would you?
No,
You're not that hungry.
Somebody is hungry, but like that, somebody is hungry, like they don't think
All right. Well, here's my sticking point, though. If he was that great an outdoorsman, he was cunning hunter. If he was that great an outdoorsman, after a day out, why would he be in that condition that he was so faint that he would not have his senses about him? So where it says in verse 34, thus Esau despised his birthright, don't you kind of think that throughout the time that the boys were growing up together, that he didn't care that much about it, that he was more concerned about immediate gratification than long-term stuff? And they just didn't see the point of it. Whereas Jacob, on the other hand, was looking downrange versus immediate. That's the way I put the two together. Because I have been out all day before, and I have come, well, the one time that I particularly remember, remember now, all of us at one point in our life was young and dumb. I went fishing in a stagnant area. The ambient temperature was 105 degrees that day. And I was in an aluminum boat. And when I saw the dark closing in, I knew that I had overheated. I got my towel and went to the water, and the water was hot to my touch. So I went to the ice bucket, which you're not supposed to do. You're not supposed to cool down that quickly. But I knew I had to cool down, so I grabbed that. And by the time I got home, we got back to the boat ramp. We left immediately. And I sat in the building. I was sitting here, and the window air conditioning unit was sitting right here blowing on me. And when I got home, I was so drained of energy that I couldn't move. But I guarantee you this, I would have not have traded Andrea in. I would not have sold my favorite fishing rod, and I wouldn't have given away my birthright. So that's how I look at it. Questions, comments then on anything dealing with chapter 25? God gave him a little nudge. Yeah. Well, but how does God work? God does not take somebody and make them do something that they are not going to do. God just takes people for who they are and will give them a little nudge. So he knew Esau's mindset, and if he got involved at all, which he probably did, he just gently nudged him along his path there. He didn't make him do something that was contrary to his belief. If he had, then where would free will be? We would not have free will. So this allowed, and remember, God knows everything anyway, so he knew what direction things were going to go. Yes, ma'am. Nope. And as Sister Little said there, that when he gets up marrying age, who does he marry? He marries people that his parents don't approve of. That's what you was going to point out? Okay. Anything else then on chapter 25? Yes, sir. I do. For this reason, if we go back to Abraham and Sarah, it was Sarah that was barren. If Abraham had not been able to procreate unless God intervened, Hagar couldn't have children by him. I know, but I'm backing up to that point because I've read a lot where people want to say that what we're looking at here is this particular chapter is backing up and covering, and he married her before. But here's my reasoning, whether it's right or wrong, here's my reasoning. Why had Abraham, and again, back up to Hagar, why had Hagar not taken another wife? Why had he been so dedicated to Sarah until Sarah said, take Hagar if he had wanted other wives? So it wasn't for that fact that he, well, when you're talking about households, that's all of the household, whether they be your kin or just, see, everybody at that time, everybody in the household, whether they were bought or a servant, if they're in the household, they belong to the master. So that doesn't necessarily mean that they were his children or his offspring. They were just in his house. But following that train of thought, though, that he didn't have a wife or a child until Sarah told him to take Hagar. So he wasn't out looking around like Solomon later and David and all like that. So it was when Sarah, in my way of looking at it, I think everything follows a strict line here because it talks about Sarah dying. Then he sends for Isaac to have a wife. Isaac marries, and now we're moving forward. So, or at least that's the way I think it all happened after her death, because he was still fertile. It was her that was not. Same way with, if we go down the road to, right here, Rebecca, she was the one that wasn't fertile. So, and God intervened. So. I'm sorry? Abraham? we want to go back farther, Noah.
But look at the Esau, they had some red, you know, some red hair. I don't know any Arabian people that.
It's kind of strange when we get into anthropological studies that way. I try to stay away from them because everything, if you believe the Bible, everything goes back to Noah, right? We're all kinfolks, no matter what color our hair is or eyes or anything else. We're all of, and all through Scripture, when it tells people not to marry somebody from here, they're not telling them not to marry because they are from a different tribe. It's because of religion. They're going to take them off the religious course. In 1964, when I was had to do a research project, the Aborigine from Australia, according to science, the Aborigine is more closely akin to Caucasian than other races. If you look at that on the surface, how in the world can that be? Don't they look totally different than the Caucasian? But yet, anthropological studies put them in the same next to versus others. So, like I say, I don't count much for this. I mean, I'm not even sending off my DNA sample to find out all my heritages because I know for a fact I'm a mixed breed. I know I've got American Indian in me. I know I've got European in me. From what European, I don't know. It don't really matter to me. You got Chinese in you. So, but as people started scattering around the world and having to deal with the climates and things like that, that's where skin colors and different attributes kicked in. Anything else on that chapter? Brother Golden. Japheth. Well, I have read a book that even said that Eve, based on mitochondrial DNA, Eve came from Northern Africa. So, anything else? Luke's out counting, so we've only got a minute or two, but let's start looking at chapter 26. There was a famine in the land because the first famine that was in the days of Abraham and Isaac, well, let me back up, I messed that up. And there was a famine in the land beside the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. So in the days of Abraham, when that famine hit, Abraham went to Egypt. Now there's another famine, which is roughly 100 years after that one, because it was shortly after he left Haran that, he was 75 or so when he left there, and it was coming down and then went. So he's 75, 80 years old. And now we're looking at 90 or so years later, 90 to 100 years later. Isaac went into Abimelech, king of the Philistines, into Gerar. Well, had not Abraham had an encounter with Abimelech? Wow. Abimelech lived a long time, right? More than likely a title or a son or a grandson at this point. They did go by titles a lot back in those days, so that's where I would put it. But thank y'all so much for your conversation today.